Hello, in this video I'm going to be using GTO Wizard to analyze a live 2-5 hand that I recently played at one of the Detroit casinos. I thought it was an interesting hand, so I wanted to dig into it a little bit more and not only just look at my particular hand and how it would play at equilibrium, but also how the rest of my range would play in this particular spot. So I'm going to be going through this in GTO Wizard, and I hope you enjoy. So this is a hand that I played recently in a 2-5 game at one of the Detroit casinos, and I had a question as to really how I should be playing the turn, not just with my own hand, but with my entire range in this spot here. So I wanted to take a look at this in GTO Wizard to really just analyze this hand and get a sense for at equilibrium how should my range be played on this turn card, so we're going to dig into that for the next 15 minutes or so. Let's quickly go through the action. We have our opponent who was I think he was a regular, but he was decent, nothing spectacular. Opened from the middle position to $15 or three big blinds. I three bet to $50 or 10 big blinds from the button with ace of clubs, jack of clubs, and my opponent calls. The effective stack was me. I had about 190 big blinds in front of me, so I had just under $1,000 in front of me with this particular hand. The flop came out king of hearts, jack of spades, five of clubs, so king jack 5 rainbow. Again, I have ace of clubs, jack of clubs. My opponent checks to me, and I put in a C bet of 1/3 pot. So in this case here, the flop is we have about, after rake, about 18 big blinds in the pot. I put about a 6 big blind or a $30 bet into the pot, and my opponent calls. The turn is the 7 of hearts, so it puts a flush draw on the board, but doesn't really complete any other draws. My opponent checks, and I have a decision to make as to whether I continue betting my ace of clubs, jack of clubs. If I do, I have to decide what size I'm going to be betting that, and I also have to decide, obviously, which hands I'm going to be continuing to bet on the turn and which hands I am going to check back. So that's a little bit of background here. Let's flip over into GTO Wizard and take a look at the spot. So again, I wanted to demonstrate how I would take a look at this spot in GTO Wizard. So as you can see here, first I have to choose my solution, and I'm playing, again, I was about 190 big blinds deep. For this particular spot, I'm going to choose the 200 big blind stack ranges. Again, I might be able to choose 150, in here, but 200 big blinds should be fine. So I filtered this down to 200 big blinds. I'm going to choose the rake structure of NL 500, and then I'm going to choose the general. I could choose the simple, and actually, I might as well just choose the simple here for for the type, just to limit the number of bet sizes here. You'll notice here that I'm also including. I'm only looking at this from a 6-max perspective. That's because GTO Wizard only has post-flop solutions for 6-max gameplay at 200 big blind deep stacks. If I chose 9-max, the game was actually 8-handed at the time. If I chose 9-max, I wouldn't have post-flop solutions, so I wouldn't actually be able to analyze this spot. So I'm choosing the 6-max spot. My opponent was middle position, so I'm going to actually just treat that as under the gun. So what we're going to do here is, now we have our stacks loaded. We're going to say this is what our opponent's range at equilibrium looks like, their opening range. Again, my opponent raised the 3 big blinds. I don't have a 3 big blind option here, so my option here is raising to 2.5x as the middle position player. Folds to me on the button, and I am 3-betting in this case here to 8.5 big blinds. But again, in my spot here, I was 3-betting to 10 big blinds, and my opponent, the under the gun player, calls. First thing to note, I don't have exactly the right parameters in here for the solve, but for the pre-configured solutions, this is a good starting point to look at here. We also can use the AI solve functionality, which I'll demonstrate in a second, and look at this from a more custom perspective. The board was King of Hearts, Jack of Spades, and the Five of Clubs. And we can take a look at on the flop. Uninterestingly, our opponent is just checking everything, which we would expect. And with our particular spot, we are mostly checking. We are mostly betting everything, which is, I would be betting range here in this spot, and I think that is a fine play when we look at the GTO output. It's only checking about 16% of the time, and no hands are purely checking. Our particular hand, Ace Jack of Clubs, is primarily a bet. If we look at the summary tab on the bottom part of the right, it's mostly a bet, and it's mostly a bet for this small 1/3 pot sizing here. Again, we had about 18 big blinds in the pot. The rake structure is a little bit different here, but actually this works out pretty nicely. So with 18 big blinds in the pot, we are betting about this 1/3 pot sizing, which is what I chose in game. And so we can choose the 1/3 pot sizing here, the 6.1, and my opponent continued through a call. It's worth looking here at the types of hands my opponent is going to have in range that he or she, in this case he, would be raising. And we can start trying to test to see do we think our opponent actually would be raising those particular hands. So hands like pocket fives, king jack here for 2 pair, and then potentially jacks here for sets. Those hands I think all would be hands that I definitely could see my opponents raising. I could also see my opponent raising hands like queen 10 suited, where they have an open-ended straight draw. Then it starts getting a little dicey. Some of these other hands, like, do I think my opponent would be check raising a hand like ace 10 suited, ace queen suited, jack 10 suited? This is where it starts getting a little bit dicey, and I'm not necessarily sure my opponent would be doing that. Some of the 5x hands, do I think my opponent would be check raising those? Maybe. I don't know. But it looks somewhat reasonable here, I guess, in general. I think this 14% check raising range might be a little high, but in general, I think this looks somewhat reasonable. In terms of the hands that they're continuing with, they're starting to fold hands as good as pocket tens. So tens and below are really starting to fold here, which I think makes sense. I think maybe you get some sticky opponents who might hang on for a flop or for a street with a hand like tens or nines or whatever the case may be. But I think for the most part, if our opponent's continuing, they're likely to have hands that are in this Broadway region or potentially a 5, right? So I think this is somewhat reasonable as to the types of hands that I think my opponent would have. So they continue through a call, and we go to a turn of a 7 of hearts. And again, my opponent is checking 100% of range, and this is where our decision lies. So we have to determine, are we betting, and what hands are we betting, and what size are we betting? And it looks like here at equilibrium, our opponent is we are checking back almost 40% of the time, and our bets are split between this 2/3 pot size bet and an over bet of 1.25x. It's what's interesting here is taking a look at the types of hands that we actually are choosing to be betting here. In game, I actually chose to check this back. I chose to check back the jack here, mainly to turn this into a situation where on the majority of rivers, I was planning on either calling a bet, or if my opponent checked me again on a river, as long as it was a safe river, I was going to put in a smaller value bet. But in this case here, what happened is I actually just decided to check this one back. But again, it got me really curious as to really trying to figure out if if I should be putting this ace jack into a bet. And if I look here specifically at this hand, ace jack of clubs, the solver is actually betting this, virtually 100% of the time, which I find interesting when I first looked at this. I think it's really really interesting that we are just continuing to bet with a lot of our hands here. If I take a look at the breakdown, we can start seeing the hands that we are choosing to bet. So we are obviously choosing to continue betting sets, two pairs, and over pairs. Our top pair hands are and our second pair hands are these are the types of hands that we're starting to split a little bit here. So when we start actually diving into the hands itself, when we start looking at the type of top pair hands that we are actually betting versus the top pair hands that we're checking. So we have a lot of King X in range. Ace King we're continuing to bet often. King Queen we're starting to check a little bit more, and then King 10 is turning into basically a pure check. King 6 is a pure check, right? So unsurprisingly here, weaker King X hands we are starting to put more into check ranges here. But again, the Jack X hands I find kind of interesting, right? So Ace Jack suited, we are purely putting this into a bet. Jack 10 of hearts, it makes sense to us, to me, that we would be betting this, especially for a large sizing with the Jack and the hearts there too. But unsurprisingly, we're checking back, some of the Jack 10 suiteds that don't have that flush draw. And then, other weaker hands that we have in range, like queens, tens, we have, some of these other hands. Actually, ace 5 suited is interesting here because the diamond variety, so where we don't block any. In this case here, we're not necessarily blocking any hands that our opponents, any of our opponents folds, because they've already folded their diamond cards in range, right? So ace 5 of diamonds seems to be a pretty good continue here in this case here. But again, interesting to start taking a look at the types of hands that we would be putting in this betting range. When we're looking at sizing, sizing is actually interesting too. That again, ace jack suited here with the clubs and the diamonds, we are actually putting them somewhat frequently into an overbet range, which again is really really interesting to me. So our overbet range here, if I just hover in on the overbet range and take a look at what that consists of, it does have like really strong hands like jacks or sevens. We have our king jack suited here. We have aces, kings. We have some ace king x, ace king type hands. But we're also continuing with some really, really, really strong hands in this range, right? So let's kind of just take a look at the strategy here and start looking at some of these betting hands in our range. We have some really, really, really good draws in there too, right? So 9-8 suited, turning the double gutter, really, really good hand to be putting into an overbet range. 10-9 suited, again, similarly, 10-9 of hearts, right, is a good hand to be putting in this overbet range. We have a lot of flush draws here that are throwing in this overbet range, especially those with combo combo draws that are in there as well too, like ace 10 of hearts. So a lot of we can see the types of hands that we want to be potentially throwing in overbet ranges, whereas the hands that we are betting smaller, hands like kings, kings really can do anything it wants here in this spot. We have some of it looks like a lot of our one pair king X hands, like ace king, ends up being in this 2/3 pot size bet as opposed to the overbet. And that's paired with, some of the bluff hands like ace queen suited. It's paired with ace 10 suited, particularly the ones without the hearts, right? So the common theme that I'm seeing here in a lot of cases is where we have, where we are bluffing, where we don't have hearts, we are more likely to be throwing those into the 2/3 pot as opposed to the overbet. Whereas the bluffs that we have, in range where we're throwing overbets, ace 7 suited. This is interesting that we're putting that into an overbet. 8-7 suited, interesting that we're putting that into the overbet. So again, we're not blocking opponents' folds here, right? Presumably our opponents are not going to necessarily have a lot of sevens in their range. So throwing those into overbets, that's actually interesting to take a look at this particular hand. what I wanted to take a look at briefly is, okay, so we're looking at this, and this is all through an equilibrium lens. I want to actually go back to pre-flop here and rerun this solution with custom ranges, because when I actually dig into this with some custom ranges here, and I can change stack sizes to actually accommodate the specific stack sizes that happen in game. I can also account for the fact that if I think my opponent's an average reg, let's go back to my opponent's pre-flop range here. We're expecting them to four bet this particular range. I don't think this opponent is going to be four betting nearly this much. So I actually I'm going to rerun this and readjust both my ranges and my opponent's range using this AI solve functionality, and we are going to see what this looks like. All right, so I reran this using the GTO Wizard AI solve functionality, and what I did was I changed the actual ranges here. So you can see the solution. I just kept the automatic bet sizes, so I didn't change anything on the bottom of this. I did change, I kept the pot size as 18.5 big blinds to account for the about 1.5 big blinds of rake being taken out. I lowered the effective stack down to 180. I kept my button 3-bet range somewhat similar. It might be a little wider than my button range, and now that I say this, I'm actually just going to rerun this again, and I am going to kind of give a cleaner sense as to what I think my button 3-bet range would look like here. All right, so this is, I think, closer to probably what my button 3-bet range would look like. And, I'm trying to be honest with myself here, but, I'm certainly 3-betting the top end with all of the, suited broadways here. But, and I definitely have some 3-bet bluffs that I choose from, and I pretty much always choose the ace 5, ace 4 suited here. I do sometimes mix in a king 5 suited here, but a lot of these lower suited connectors, I don't necessarily pull the trigger as much as I probably should, right? So let's, being honest with myself, I'm trying to update my own particular ranges here to see how this changes. So again, I'm not changing anything else. I'm going to create the solution. It's going to rerun and everything and recreate this solution. As you can see, GTO Wizard is super fast with everything. So with these updated ranges, and this is what I kind of picked for what I thought my opponent's range would look like here. So, again, I think they are going to be four betting the top end, but I did not expect them to be four betting a lot of their suited broadways as much as they were. I didn't expect them to be four betting these hands down low as much as they were. So what I did here was for these top end hands, so hands like ace king, I have them four betting at half the time and calling half the time. Ace queen, I have them four betting here. In this case here, I believe it's this is half the time as well too. Whereas ace jack, I have them calling or folding here in this spot here, folding 75% of the time. Same with king queen off. But hands like queens, either they're going to four bet half the time or call half the time. Jacks, they might four bet 25% of the time and call half the time, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a little bit weaker on the four bet range for my opponent, and I think this is probably reasonable to what I expect them to do. GTO Wizard has them at equilibrium checking 100%, and it has me betting 100%, which is, again, reasonable to what my strategy would look like. So nothing to change there. As for what my opponent would be check raising, and it seems like there's a lot of check raises in range. The check raises on the flop would be consisting of, again, fives, jacks, king jack suited. But again, are they going to be grabbing check raises in this ace queen variety, ace 10 variety? I think that's I'm questioning that. wouldn't be surprised to see it on the Queen 10 variety with the open-ended straight draw. But I think a lot of the opponents you might see at a typical 2-5 game are going to struggle to find some of these check raises, especially in these 3-bet pots where it's a little bit harder to pull the trigger on some of these bigger some of these bigger pots. Ace-5 suited. Do I really think they're going to be pulling the trigger on a 3-bet on a 3-bet pot check raising Ace-5 suited? I don't know, but. Again, interesting to see, and we can certainly test that. We can test that by node locking. So that's something I do dig into in my GTO Wizard module, but it is something that we could do if we clicked on this and we wanted to actually test. Maybe we want to add this as just calls and lower their check raise range. We can certainly test that and actually rerun the solves here. But I'm not going to bother going into that in this video because I'm trying to keep it in that 15 to 20 minute range. So through a call here, we have a turn of the 7 of hearts, and on the 7 of hearts, our opponent is checking, and we're taking a look at what our strategy looks like here. So again, we are polarizing. We're polarizing here. Now, GTO Wizard likes to only overbet or check. Which is interesting, and with our particular hand is actually now being put into a check range, which again is interesting. This goes to show how small changes in the inputs can really change the output somewhat significantly. So it's not to say that my choice of checking back with Ace Jack of clubs was correct or not correct, right? It depends on a wide variety of assumptions. These ranges could be very, very off from what the actual ranges of what happened in gameplay. But what is interesting here is just taking a look at, again, how the outputs change based on the inputs that I do change, right? So, the hands it's choosing to bet large here in this spot, jacks, kings, king jack suited, not surprising, right? Aces, ace king suited, right? And then there's some really good draw hands. Ace 10 suited here is betting large. 10-9 suited betting large here, 9-8 suited betting large here with the double gutter, right? So there's a lot of hands that are being put into this large bet range, and then we have certain hands that are being put into this check back range. Again, this is just kind of showing the functionality of GTO Wizard. If I were really, I could spend a lot of time on this particular hand and node lock through this, change inputs, considerably. But I think this is kind of showing how the tool can be used directly in my own browser here to not just look at pre-solved solutions, which we obviously can see that it does pretty well, but also dig into custom solutions where previously I might have to dig into it using a PO solver or a GTO Plus, but now I can do so using this tool in my browser. So that's all I'm going to spend time digging through in this particular video. Again, I hope you enjoy this video, and if you want more GTO Wizard content, please let me know by either commenting on this video or reaching out to me through the Solver School website. Thanks a lot. Thanks for watching this analysis. I hope you enjoyed me diving through this hand and using GTO Wizard. If you are interested in this type of content, I just released a brand new module to my Solver Masterclass course. This module is entirely focused on how to use GTO Wizard in your day-to-day studies. I cover everything from the study section, the practice section, the analyze section, and I go through a variety of use cases showing you how to use GTO Wizard to power your solver studies and really improve in your understanding of the game of poker. You can get this How to Use GTO Wizard module as a standalone module for $99 on my Solver School website at www.solverschool.com. Or you can get it as a part of my Solver Masterclass, which contains all of my solver related content, over 40 hours worth of content that covers everything that you need to know on how to use solvers to really, really amp up your understanding of this game of poker. The Solver Masterclass is normally on sale for $599, but if you act now and use the code GTO23, you can get $100 off the Solver Masterclass through the end of this year in 2023. So again, that's www.solverschool.com. Thanks for watching.